Give unto the Lord, O you mighty ones, give unto the Lord the glory due to his name. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Worship is a central aspect of Christianity. We were created to worship. The eternal state will be a state of worship. Our whole lives ought to be lives of worship, worshipping our God in the beauty of holiness. Hello, welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley on YouTube. I'm Pastor Gervais Charmley, and in this video I'm continuing the series on these old volumes, solid, meaty volumes of divinity, Scottish divinity, the Cunningham Lectures. And in this particular video I want to talk about the 14th Cunningham Lectures volume, the public worship of Presbyterian Scotland, historically treated, the 14th series of the Cunningham Lectures by Charles Greig McCrie, minister at Ayr. Now, the name McCrie, the surname, may ring some bells for some of you watching, and if it does, then it's because it's the surname of the famous biographer of John Knox, Thomas McCrie the Elder, and he was Charles McCrie's grandfather. Charles McCrie's father, William, was the second son of that great Scottish church historian, whose biography of Knox, although in some ways superseded, for one thing, we now know that Knox was actually born 10 years later than McCrie and his contemporaries thought. There was some confusion as to two different men called John Knox, and there was an assumption, a false assumption, that they were the same man. But other than that rather important point and a few details, Thomas McCrie's biography of Knox remains a classic account of the life, the career of the great Scottish reformer. And Thomas McCrie wrote many other works on Scottish church history. Well, William, the second son of Thomas, was brought up in his father's denomination, the original Old Light anti-burgher secession synod. This was one of those churches that came out of the evangelical period of the 18th century. It was a period when the Church of Scotland was deeply compromised in terms of teaching and theology. It wasn't so much a speculative liberalism as it was a false practical theology, the idea we are practical, so we talk about life tips, and they didn't preach the gospel. It was all dry as dust. And so it was that there were those who left the Church of Scotland to find gospel teaching, and ministers who were excluded. And as happens in these cases, sometimes there were disagreements, and there were divisions and further divisions. So you ended up with the original Old Light anti-burgher seceders. William McCrie, at the induction of his son Charles at Ayr, gives some account of this background. Our fathers were distinguished for many things. They were very orthodox and sound in the faith, and they abounded in prayer. But he could not help thinking that they were not so distinguished for their works as for their faith. The division between the burghers and the anti-burghers came down to an oath that burgesses, members of town councils, were supposed to swear when they took office in certain Scottish towns and cities, to uphold the established religion. And there were those who said, well, this means the Church of Scotland. we are seceders from the Church of Scotland, therefore we cannot swear this. Others said, no, this means the Reformed faith, and we hold the Reformed faith far more strongly than the Church of Scotland. And so there was a division between those who were for the Burgess Oath and those who were against it, the anti-burghers. One story he told was this. There was a young man, an anti-burgher, who was courting a young woman who was a burgher, and a great controversy arose as to what church they should go to after the marriage. However, as has happened ever since the creation of the world, the woman prevailed, and the young man promised to go to the burgher kirk. He had a collie dog, however, named Jerry, which had been in the habit of attending the anti-burgher kirk since its infancy. And on the kirking day, when the newly married couple took the turning to the burgher kirk, Jerry lifted up his witness against them, and went and took up his regular place in the anti-burgher kirk. And you think, yes, that was what happened in those days. And yet they were faithful. They were concerned with being faithful. Even if we look back today and we say, but some of this was more than a little, shall we say, over-precise. But they believed, and they acted on their belief. Well, Charles Greig McCrie, the author of the Public Worship of Presbyterian Scotland, historically considered, was born in 1836 in Edinburgh. He studied at Edinburgh University and went up to New College to study for the ministry of the Free Church of Scotland. There he took the highest place in the church history class taught by none other than William Cunningham himself, the man for whom the Cunningham Lectures were named and in whose memory they were instituted. He was ordained to the Free Church of Scotland at Barry, a little village, in 1862, and for 2 years and 8 months he was a country pastor. In 1864 he was called to the South Free Church, Blairgowrie, and it was from Blairgowrie that he was then called to Free St Mark's, Glasgow, in the 1870s. But he was only at Glasgow for a few years before he was called to Ayr, to the Free Church there. McCrie he was a most impressive man. One thing that's impressive about him, you find in this book, this is the history of the Free Church at Ayr. You find this wonderful picture with his incredibly impressive whiskers. It's a wonderful image of this Victorian clergyman, this Victorian Scottish minister looking suitably rugged. He was a popular preacher. The fact that he was called from Barry to Blairgowrie, from Blairgowrie to Glasgow, from Glasgow to Ayr, indicates that he was a man who was somewhat in demand. He wrote a number of magazine articles. He wrote a few books, although his magnum opus is the Cunningham Lectures volume. But he also wrote this, the Church of Scotland, her divisions and unions, and his other notable and great work is this one from 1906, The Confessions of the Church of Scotland. He remained at Ayr until the end of his ministry, and he died in 1910. Put that one back. Now this volume, this Cunningham Lectures volume, he was appointed as the Cunningham Lecturer in 1890 to give him a couple of years to prepare the work. These are solid works. It takes a lot of effort, particularly on the part of somebody who has something else to do. He was a pastor. Other lecturers were professors. And so it takes time to prepare this sort of scholarship. As it was, he took a 2-month sabbatical from his work at Ayr in order to spend all that time in Edinburgh studying, getting this ready. So 1876 he went to Ayr, 1890 Cunningham Lecturer, 1892 delivered the lectures, 1893 St Andrews University, on the strength of these lectures, awarded him the degree of Doctor of Divinity. He took as his subject, as we said, the public worship of Presbyterian Scotland. Now, when considering public worship, of course, it's important to look not only at Presbyterian Scotland, but Scotland before Presbyterianism. He opens the lectures thus: Presbyterianism is essentially a system of church polity, having government by presbyters for its distinguishing feature. It differs from episcopacy in refusing to acknowledge any such governing power in the hands of prelates or diocesan bishops as would constitute them an order in succession to the apostleship, separate from and superior to presbyters. It is distinct from independency, which lodges the government of the church in the individual congregation. According to Presbyterian rule, all ecclesiastical authority is lodged in the presbyters, as the genuine bishops of the New Testament, with whom is the true apostolic succession, the presbyters being associated for purposes ministerial or administrative in congregational sessions, classical presbyteries, provincial synods, and general assemblies. While, however, Presbyterianism is essentially a form of government, historically it is a great deal more than that. There has come to be associated with it Christian life of a particular type, the confessional theology of a pronounced school, and a well-defined ritual of divine service. It is with the last named concomitant or characteristic of Presbyterianism, that of worship, that we are concerned in this historical inquiry, and our range of treatment is limited to tracing the development of public worship in that country which, from the dawn of the Protestant era until now, in spite of repeated attempts to dictate and coerce, to subvert and innovate, has asserted herself Presbyterian in polity, in theology, and in ritual. So that is his introduction. He begins by looking at, as he puts it, Celtic and Anglo-Roman worship. And even the chapter title tells us part of the argument. Celtic worship is true Scottish worship. That's what he's effectively is arguing here. Celtic worship had a deep Scottish root, but medieval Catholic worship in Scotland was Anglo-Roman, i.e. foreign. And so the Reformation in Scotland is not the embracing of something that is alien to Scotland, it is the rejecting of something that is alien to Scotland. The Scottish reformers, while they are influenced by and interacting with reformers in other countries, including England, but most notably, of course, in Geneva, they are Scottish, and they produce a worship that is Scottish. It is different from Geneva. It is not just Geneva in English or in Scots. It is Scottish. The ritual revisions of the Middle Ages, while they do have a Scottish element, nevertheless they're influenced by France. It's not until the Reformation that you have Scottish ministers dictating, teaching worship to a Scottish church. That is part of his argument. The Book of Common Order, he goes on in the third chapter, is on the Book of Common Order, commonly called Knox's Liturgy,
but part of his argument is that while Knox was deeply involved with it, it is not Knox's. There were others involved as well. Secondly, it's not a liturgy in the same way the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England is a liturgy. It is instead a guide for ministers. The fourth period, the fourth chapter, is the Westminster Directory. And of course, the Westminster Assembly, that is England. The Westminster Directory is produced in England. So why is it that the Westminster Directory, the Westminster Confession, Westminster Standards become much more influential in Scotland than in England? It's a fascinating thing to look at. One of the things that he speaks of course, he speaks not only of the Westminster Assembly, but what happened afterwards. He speaks of the killing times, the persecution, and also deals with the reality that the public worship in Scotland under the restored episcopal government under Charles II and James VII. He's James VII in Scotland, James II in England, but this is a Scottish book. The restored episcopal worship is actually just carrying on Presbyterian forms of worship. The difference isn't something that will be noticed in the parishes, it's something that happens higher up. His fifth chapter is on revolution, union, and decadence. And the sixth, the modern Renaissance, the recovery of worship in the church. It's a fascinating book to look at how worship, public worship, developed and changed, and sometimes didn't change, in the Church of Scotland. That the Church of Scotland, and of course you then have the divisions, you have the secessions, and all of them, all the Scottish secessions, the seceders that his own family came from, the Reformed Presbyterians, the Relief Presbytery, the Free Church of Scotland, all of them say we are more faithful to the old Presbyterian standards than the Church of Scotland. It's a fascinating type of division. Moderatism was one of the blights, it was the great blight of the Church of Scotland in the 18th and 19th centuries. Moderatism. Moderatism meant not being too excited about anything. Moderatism meant moderating zeal in the church. A lot of it came from a fear of fanaticism. The 18th century, in many ways, in Scotland and England, is a reaction against perceived fanaticism, and actual fanaticism, in the 17th century. People looking and say, well, if 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, people were being persecuted, put to death for their religious opinions, then clearly being too zealous about religious opinions is a bad thing. But what this leads to is an impression given by ministers, theologians, that these things just aren't very important. And moderatism tends to be dull and boring and unexciting. What is needed is zeal for truth, is speaking the truth in love. Now, when we think of the public worship of Presbyterian Scotland, anyone who has been to the Highlands, to a free church service in the Highlands, that's the historic Presbyterian worship. The unaccompanied psalms, the centrality of the sermon. That is, it's a Protestant worship. You go into an old-fashioned Scottish church building, and what you will see is a building that is very like the historic independent Presbyterian Baptist meeting houses in England. The pulpit is central. The table if there is a permanent table, is in front of it. The church is gathered around the Word, and the Word is central. And there is the table which speaks of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, a sacrifice not repeated, but remembered. He is in the midst. We hear him when we worship. This is primarily it's a historical sketch. It is, of course, 1890, 1892, so it comes to that point and stops. Things have changed since then, but to consider worship and the heroism of our forefathers, it's a great read, and I encourage it. So there we go, The Public Worship of Presbyterian Scotland by Charles Greig McCrie, D.D. Thank you for watching. May God help us to consider how we worship him, and to read the best books, and especially the best book of all, the Bible. Amen.